SonicState.com.
That's right. You've caught me listening to some low-frequency waveforms. Welcome to my state-of-the-art sonic laboratory. I love synthesizers. ARPs, Oberheims, Moogs, even crappy old German PPGs. I love them all. But I'm not talking about the love that a man has for a well-made piece of furniture or a fine wine. I'm talking about deep carnal lust. Gear lust, if you will. And just as any embittered aging Lothario speaks of past loves, so tonight I will lead you by the hand and take you through some of the finest synthesizers ever made. That's right, it's the top 20 synths of all time, ever. Here's the Selena. The sound of this string ensemble keyboard became as synonymous with 70s discos as Rehypno has become in many of today's chain pubs.
A lot of the famous Cure sounds came from a Selena string machine, and we never took that on stage. I sampled that into my E4, and before that it was sampled into Prophet 2000. Probably the first time I heard that was Herbie Hancock using it as those, you know, he'd do like on the Headhunters era, there'd be like a big funky groove, and then they'd space out and he'd do a big Rhodes solo, and then the strings would come in and they sounded incredible.
This would definitely be in my top 5 most important keyboards of all time. It's kind of average until you hit the modulation, and they had like a 3-tier chorus or something like that you never hear it quite resolve, and it's the most beautiful modulation. It's Dreamweaver, that song Dreamweaver. It's every string sound on that. It's all over Heroes and Low. It fills such a great space.
It was a great sound, and quite difficult to sample. So in the studio we'd always use the real thing, but every tour we're like, let's try and get a better sample out of it this time. In the end I gave up and I just used the synth string sound on the XP50. It sounded similar, you know.
You're watching SonicState.com. Piltdown Man, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, all rare animals, but none quite as rare as the white version of the next synthesizer on our list, the Roland SH-101. Normally available in grey, blue and red, the ultra-rare white version of this synthesizer has entered electronic folklore.
Chemical Brothers, Prodigy, Aphex Twin, 808 State, Future Sound of London, Orbital, everybody used a 101. I think it was a real kind of rock star keyboard in a lot of respects, because you could strap it on and sort of play it like a guitar and sort of pose around with it. Which was kind of bizarre really, because the sort of sounds it was creating were much more suitable for kind of studio-based recordings. You get that amazing sort of rock-solid, rubbery sort of bass sound that would fill out the bottom end of your track, but it could also do the kind of squidgy lines, the sort of acidy lines over the top, so in some respects it was a very dynamic keyboard. Well, the disadvantages were no memory and no MIDI, although you can get retrofits and so on. I think the 101 was about as funky and sexy as Roland ever got.
You're watching SonicState.com. One of the first bands to use synths on stage were legendary 70s space rockers Hawkwind. A lot of people didn't know what synths they used because they were too distracted by the charms of Stacia, the exotic dancer that Hawkwind used in their shows. Tragically, Stacia left Hawkwind in 1975 to become a deputy headmistress at a school in Hamburg. Apparently her assemblies are awesome. Here's the VCS3.
I think the no keyboard thing, I quite like that, you see, because straight away it takes you somewhere else. It takes you away from the idea that you're going to play some kind of synth lead or you're going to use it for a bass part or any of those things. You know, you just got a button that you push, it makes whatever noise it's going to make when you trigger it with that, and that's a very different way of thinking about, you know, making a musical contribution from a synthesizer. And I think it kind of gives you a much less friendly environment to work with, and then it confronts you with the, you know, the electronics kind of much more upfront way.
The oscillators sound lovely and the filter sounds lovely and the reverb's really clanky and hissy and brilliant, and as soon as you put it on a recording, which we're doing a lot at the moment, it just sounds like a record immediately. It has a really lo-fi sound about it. I mean, it immediately sounds glued into the track. I remember being at my granny's and seeing like Doctor Who and stuff, and the Dalek voice on Doctor Who was the VCS3 ring modulator. Loads of idents on television and radio and stuff were done by the Radiophonic Workshop, often with VCS3. Fantastic sound, incredible noise. The modulation possibilities are absolutely enormous. You can send things back into themselves because it has this great big routing pin matrix. It has a joystick, which is just a brilliant controller. There's not many synths, old synths have that on. And you can patch that to 3 or 4 different things, so wherever you move it, lots of stuff is moving. I mean, it's the sort of thing we get in software quite a lot now, with pads and virtual pads, or, you know, where it's a brilliant idea of sending modulation stuff all over the place just by tiny movements. David Vorhaus's first record, Electric Storm, there's VCS3 all over that. It's totally brilliant. Brilliant programming. I think that's lots of chopped up tape, so I reckon they would have made sounds, little arpeggios and things, and then put them together on tape. A lot of people use them now in studios as a piece of outboard and just send drum kits through the filter, not to sweep it or anything, but just to give it a kind of slightly crunchy sound.
If you put sounds through it, it's like just giving them a lovely sepia tint. You know, whatever you put into it, suddenly just goes, 1969. It's just kind of slightly broken and rather beautiful.
That's it for now. Join us next time as we continue our countdown of the 20 greatest synths of all time, ever.
Well, they're robust. They're made out of wood and metal and all that, but they don't like being lugged around too much.
They're pretty reliable. We might yet build a more modern version of that.
I don't think anybody likes DX7s, do they?
SonicState.com. SonicState.com.
Welcome back to the top 20 greatest synths of all time, ever. I saw the sign, and it opened up my eyes, and I am happy now living without you. I've left you 000. Ace of Base. One of Sweden's finest exports, as is the next synthesizer on our list, the Nord lead. Sounds like it should come from Norway, but then again the Swede lead would just sound ridiculous.
Xavier's Nord lead is a perfect example of the right product at just the right time. After years of putting up with sample-based workstations and horrible incremental data entry systems, people were going back to buying up all the old analog synths with all the associated problems, going out of tune and trying to keep them running all the time. So what Xavier did was, first of all, to bring back a proper control surface so you can get in there and interact with the sound as you're playing, which is one of the great things that attracts people to analog synths in the first place. The second thing was, smartly they decided not to smother the whole thing in effects, so not only did it look like an analog synth, but when you played it, the sound was so raw, it kind of fooled you into thinking it was a genuine analog synth.
You're watching SonicState.com. Next up, it's the Emu Proteus. Although they sound god-awful nowadays, owning one of these back in the 80s was the equivalent of being reincarnated as Phil Collins with hair, if you can imagine such a thing.
You know, you want a piano, so you wait 40 seconds for the Prophet 2002 to load, and then suddenly this box comes on that's 1U, the Proteus, and it's just got everything you need in it to write. It really was my primary writing tool for, I don't know, probably 5 years. All of these sounds coming out of one box after having to deal with, you know, floppy disks and hard drives for years, and it's just incredible. And now, like if I'm trying to write a real song, but the Proteus 2000 is what I go to, because it's every sound that you need is in there. If just like for sort of fleshing out ideas, and then you might want to refine it and bring in, you know, a better sample. But some of the Proteus 2000 things are still, you know, great, and that's nearly 10 years old, isn't it?
Put that down and click on this, SonicState.com. Ah, Howard Jones. Bless you and your jumper-wearing, vegetable-chomping electro-pop ways. Next up is the Jupiter 8, or JP8, the synth made famous by Mr. Jones and his imaginatively titled hit, New Song.
Jupiter 8 came along at quite an interesting time because although it was pre-MIDI, it had this device whereby you could use it to connect with drum machines. So one of the key things at the time was to say take a TR-808, one of the classic Roland drum machines, and then hook it up to say the arpeggiator of the Jupiter 8, and everything would stay in time. So you could in effect run the arpeggio from the lower part of the instrument and then play leads or chords from the upper part, and that was quite a revelation at the time.
Always for me, it was about making sounds that people hadn't made before and heard before. Because everyone else, if you think of up to 1980, 50s, 60s and 70s, people had done band stuff really well. Everyone had, taken it as far as it could go, in my opinion. And as a young person, you don't really want to be competing with that. You want to be trying to set off on your own course. So synthesizers, for me, being a keyboard player, offered the opportunity for this huge limitless soundscape and a way of making your mark, doing something different. Having done the 20th anniversary show last year at Shepherd's Bush, I put together my original rig with Jupiter 8, Juno 60, the Pro One, 2 Prodigies, 808 drum machine, and between them, those make such a fantastic sound. I mean, I think it would be the Jupiter 8 is my favourite. It's got such fat, wonderful sound. It's just gorgeous sound. Well, I haven't heard anything that sort of emulates a Jupiter 8 or a Juno 60, or a Prodigy. I think you could probably get close to a Pro One, close. But those are, of course, I'm very interested in those because they're my favourites. So with the Arturia one, which I really love, I was talking about the Mini Moog and the Modular Moog. I mean, I have never been able to have two side by side, but they sound incredible to me. I mean, the virtual ones. I mean, really, and also to have a Mini Moog as a polyphonic instrument. It's fantastic. If you're the sort of person who is trying to be like other people, then, well, forget it, because it's not going to last, You'll be chasing that forever. You've got to find what is original and different about yourself, and develop that, and then just go on that course 100%. And then there'll be times when you're in fashion, times when you're out of fashion, but it's irrelevant. You just do what you do 100%, and always keep trying and develop it, and not like get set in stone, some sort of 80s relic or something.
So here's the countdown. At 20, it's the ARP Selena. At 19, the Roland SH-101. At 18, the VCS-3. At number 17, the Nord Lead. At 16, it's the EMU Proteus. At 15, the Roland Jupiter 8. That's it for now. Join us next time as we continue our countdown of the 20 greatest synths of all time, ever.
Technically, it's a very interesting instrument. There's not much into it, but it does a great deal.
It's the only new instrument since, what, saxophone?
It's buzzy, imprecise, it's squishy.
SonicState.com. SonicState.com.
Welcome back to the top 20 greatest synths of all time ever. Most people think of jazz funk as whingy, lightweight nonsense, but I say give it a chance. Back in the 80s, with half a crate of leaf flower milk inside you, it was sounding pretty good. Next up, it's the Yamaha CS80.
Okay. That's a simple thing. And at the same time, you can, this sound, you can bring feeling.
CS80 was a magnificent beast, and beast is the operative word. I forget how much it weighed, but I do remember as a reasonably athletic young man trying to lug this thing around for a couple of gigs, and that's it. It just went out the window after that.
Change again. Same sound, exactly.
But you had a weighted keyboard, I mean, you had aftertouch on it, the response was gorgeous. And as far as I'm concerned, the pitch ribbon has never ever been surpassed in terms of expression. Stevie Wonder actually wore his out, or two as I understand, which is certainly something.
In fact, we have a lot of different families of sound, put them together. It's like a symphony orchestra, it does exactly the same thing. Or going to crazy things like I mean, in 2 minutes we can go through the whole history of music progression.
You're watching SonicState.com, and I'm watching you.
And of course, the most fun is the sample and hold, which is controlled by this rate, the LFO rate, and how high the noise generator is.
Now, a trumpet should look like this and sound something like this. But on a mellotron, it looks like this and sounds something like this. I know which one I prefer.
Hello there. I suppose you thought you were listening to a long playing record just then. Well, you weren't. You were listening to a new instrument that David Nixon and I have helped develop in this country. It makes the actual sounds of the orchestra. So come over and meet my son-in-law, will you? And the mellotron.
These were devised originally to enter the home organ market. The idea that people would buy these maybe instead of an organ for their home. And they didn't really catch on, and it took quite a while before anybody found a home for these things. Because of its anomalies, the wow and the flutter and the signal to noise ratio and all these things, it had a bit of a peculiar quality. But all these artifacts only add to the charisma of the instrument. It just made it a really interesting thing.
Well, explain how it works, please.
Well, actually, it's fairly straightforward. It's a musical computer, and as you know, Eric, the right hand is lead instruments with a choice of 18 different ones, and the left hand is rhythms in this half and backgrounds in this half, and it's all been fed onto hundreds of tape tracks.
It was something like you get from IKEA, you know, it wasn't particularly well put together. It was too short to get your knees under for a start, so we had to carry around 4 breeze blocks, which is the most important part of the Stackridge kit, so that I could put it on these breeze blocks so I could get my knees underneath it and play the piano and switch around to the mellotron.
Fantastic instrument, fantastic sounding instrument. I've used them most of my career. I love them. They're wonderful machines.
Now, back in the early days of synthesis, unstable oscillators would often cause the instrument's notes to vary wildly on stage, making the music virtually unlistenable. To counteract these effects, the audience would often take huge amounts of amphetamines. As the years went on, the technology improved and the notes stabilised, but the drug use spiralled out of all control. Nobody knows why. Here's the Juno 60.
It was the first of Roland's polyphonic programmable synths to include presets. It was pre-MIDI, it only had 1 oscillator and 56 patches of memory. The programmability meant that everyone wanted to use it on stage. And it just looked really, really good. The black casing, the sliders, the colour scheme, the wood panels on the side, it looked great. Lots of acts used to use them. The Eurythmics, Vince Clarke, Howard Jones, these days Faithless, Add N2X. After the Juno 60 came the 106, which was really a Juno 60 with MIDI. With all the kind of brilliant warmth and the richness of the sound, the Juno range just couldn't fail for Roland.
これね、ローランドのジュノ106ってストリングスやオルガンサウンドをはじめ128種類のオリジナルサウンドがメモリーできるんだ。スピーカーがついてるわ。うん、スイッチオンですぐ演奏できるってわけ。アキラのサウンドジュノ 106S ローランドから。
So here's the countdown. At 20, it's the ARP Selena. At 19, the Roland SH101. At 18, the VCS3. At number 17, the Nord Lead. At 16, it's the EMU Proteus. At 15, the Roland Jupiter 8. At number 14, the Yamaha CS80. In at 13, the Mellotron. At 12, the Juno 60. That's the end of the fun for now. Join us next time on the top 20 greatest synths of all time, ever.
When I first got it, I couldn't get a sound out of it.
It is one of my favourite synths. In fact, it would be a toss-up between that and the Mini Moog.
Well, it had some fantastic sound.
I don't think anybody likes DX7s, do they?
SonicState.com. SonicState.com.
Welcome back to the top 20 synthesizers of all time ever. Let's start this time by dispelling some common myths about synthesizers. Myth 1. Synthesizers were invented by Kraftwerk. Contrary to popular belief, synthesizers were actually invented over 100 years ago by this man, Elisha Gray. Myth 2. A synthesizer is just a piano that you plug in. All right, it might look like a piano, but this is only to give it the look of a familiar instrument. Many synthesizers have knobs, some have a fingerboard like the Persephone, and some you don't even need to touch, like the notorious theremin. Here's the Oberheim OB8.
Yeah, Oberheim really started in about 1970 in Oakland, California, and Tom was basically making kind of peripheral devices for, you know, synths and stuff as a kind of way of extracting other tones from, say, things like Mini Moogs and stuff like that. He built an add-on device called a SEM, which was a synthesizer expander module, and this became the kind of backbone of the 2, 4 and 8 voice instruments which later came along, and they were massive beasts, the big white face things. Beautiful sounding but very unwieldy, quite difficult to tame. In effect, each expander module was a synth in its own right, so in effect you programmed one for one voice, another for another voice, and so on. So you can imagine trying to tune something like this, particularly in a live performance. Kind of last in a trilogy. You had the OBX, the OBX-A, and then the OB8. And the OB8 was really used because it had much more modulation routing. It was basically 8 synths in one. Every time you played a note, it would cycle through each of the synths. Prince used it a lot with 1999 and Eddie Van Halen with Jump. So it's got that kind of big, brassy kind of sound, but it's also very, you know, it can be very mellow and also really aggressive. It was really one of the kind of seminal LA glossy sound synths, as it were, and immensely powerful.
You're watching SonicState.com. Myth 3. You have to be an emotionless robot to play a synthesizer. Most people think of electronic musicians as miserable old fools. But what about Chris Lowe? What about Jean-Michel Jarre? What about the bloke from Sparks? Think again. Into the top 10. At 10, here's the ARP 2600.
You know, I think of a film like Close Encounters, where, you know, they use the ARP 2600, and at that point, you know, the ARP 2600 was the kind of most high-tech bit of music equipment on the planet, you know, and that's why it kind of got used, you know, as this kind of communication with aliens. You know, we've got this, you know, our musical instruments have kind of kept pace with some advanced alien technology.
The 2600 just seems so flexible. You could just patch anything into anything, and I liked the layout of the front panel of it. I liked the fact that it was a consistent layout. You know, everything was pretty well thought out, where the locations of the oscillators and the location of the filter and amplifier, ring modulator, and such. It makes sense to me. You know, the output channels on the side, and you can control your reverb and levels and everything all in a nice logical place. The Moog Model 15, which was also a modular analog, was sort of a mishmash. You know, everything's sort of wherever the guy who put it together seemed to want to put it, and it was a lot harder to understand. The Odyssey is cool too, but it just seemed limited. You know, compared to, you know, when you're put in a room and you get this 2600 versus an Odyssey. I mean, I kind of understood how to make sounds, and you couldn't do the crazy stuff that you could as easily. The 2600 is a big beast. Then there's the Odyssey. Then the next one down would be either the Axe, or there's also there's another one called the Solus. That was a pretty popular device, but it didn't hit the market until the very end of the ARP company's life. The 2600 is great for bass lines and leads and that sort of thing. You can also plug a guitar into it like you can with most of the other ARP synthesizers to get the Pete Townsend, you know, Who Are You type of effect, and or whatever else you want to do with it. You know, it's a pretty cool synth.
Hi there. I don't know where I am, but you're watching SonicState.com. Now, if I were to come up to you at a party, for instance, and say, "Hello, I've got a virus. I'd like to pass it on to you," you'd probably have me down as some kind of disease-ridden maniac. But not in the world of electronic music, because the virus is the next synthesizer on our countdown. So if someone does offer you a virus at a party, just ask to see the hardware up front, eh?
I'm totally in love with the virus. Actually, what I do is I don't have the hardware version, I have the TDM version, which I use in my Pro Tools system. If you want to make serious electronic music, I think it's one of the best synths on the market. And what I like is the combination in pop music, like very slick, smart synthesizer arpeggiators in the background or analog pads. That's what I use it for the most.
I've got the Virus C, the desktop version. It's 32 voice, 16-part multi-timbral, 2 filters, 3 LFOs, 256 presets. I use the presets a lot without editing them. And they're so good and they sit in the mix nicely. But when it comes to editing the sounds, the Virus is so well laid out that it makes it really, really easy. It's got a deep, rich, warm, sort of wonderful analog sounding leads and 303s and 101s. The drum sounds are fantastic. And the presets cover a lot of the lo-fi sort of sounds like stylophones and Casios and a lot of FM sounding patches. And once you start editing those, you get some really, really good effects. I was working on a Doctor Who audio project. I just didn't feel the need to use anything else apart from the Virus. And this is effects as well as music. It covers the whole dynamic range of sounds really convincingly and very wonderfully. I think I can say it's the best synth I've ever used. It's fantastic.
So here's the countdown. At 20, it's the ARP Selena. At 19, the Roland SH101. At 18, the VCS3. At number 17, the Nord Lead. At 16, it's the EMU Proteus. At 15, the Roland Jupiter 8. At number 14, the Yamaha CS80. In at 13, the Mellotron. At 12, the Juno 60. At number 11, it's the Oberheim OB8. Into the top 10, at 10, the ARP 2600. At 9, it's the Virus. That's that for now. Join us next time on the top 20 greatest synths of all time, ever.
There's all the major musicians. Everybody who is anybody wanted to get them to play both live and in the studio.
They're pretty reliable. We might yet build a more modern version of that.
I hated it because it didn't have any knobs on it and it was brown.
SonicState.com. SonicState.com.
Welcome back. Next up is the Roland JV1080.
Yeah, I remember we got the JV1080 because I started doing some remixes and I didn't have anything that sounded very expensive. And I remember the JV1080 just had lots of really nice wide pads and the effects in it were particularly good and it just seemed to sit well in a track. And not half bad synth sounds as well. And I just remember it was really good for sort of basic keyboard sounds, organs, pads, sort of nice thick things that you could use in the background, and strings were really good on it as well, and apparently some really good basses. And again, it was one of those ones that was quite difficult to program. Even though it had a big screen, it was still a bit like programming a D110 or something, and it was, if you were in the wrong mode, you pressed the button and you came out of where you, I just remember it being a bit of a nightmare, but it did sound good, and it had a lot of voices. That was the thing that kind of it stood out. But it was quite expensive, and I kept it for quite a long time until everything started to go inside the computer. But sometimes I sort of think, oh, actually, that'd be quite useful. I mean, it wasn't a very innovative synth, but it was a very good sort of workhorse, and it did do 16-part multi-timbral as well, so that was pretty good.
You're watching SonicState.com. I love electronic music. Ever since I was a kid and I saw the band Yazoo play live in concert. Ever since then I've begged, borrowed and even stolen huge amounts of analogue kit. I've even got a Korg MS-20. Well, a picture of one anyway.
Well, with Golfrap, it's a processor. And it's partly because I know it so well and I've played it live, and it's a great machine to gig with live. It is the best pitch-to-voltage machine that I know, and it doesn't do a very good job of it. But again, it's the way it sort of doesn't succeed that is interesting and really, truly great.
We did on Half Day Closing put Beth's voice through the MS-20. It's a kind of strange psychedelic track with all sorts of nonsense going on, and her voice went through a Leslie cabinet and a Space Echo, and it was also the split signal went off to an MS-20 and it was tracking, the oscillator was tracking our voice, it can go madly off to some wild octave somewhere else, which in our case it sounded great on that day, and it was just set down in the mix. You can play like weedy melodies and thin little sounds and stuff. You can almost always get something out of it that's cool. The Korg MS-20. It's got 2 oscillators, and it's got this mad ring modulator, which is really, really cool. It's really clangy and nasty. And these fantastic 2 filters, and get these resonances up high and mess around with those 2, and it's absolutely cool. Couple of envelopes, a really kind of involved envelope with this massive long hold time on it. It's got a continuously variable shape here. You can go from all through the pulse. It doesn't switch, so you can sweep through the shapes, which is really cool. And then it's got all its patching stuff here, which is sometimes it's really complicated and you have to read the manual, and that really doesn't help either, so then you have to talk to your mates. It's not intuitive at all, this. Yeah, it looks cool as well. I love it. This is all metal and really nice, and when it's got some scratches on it, it's even better. It makes it look cooler.
Synth demo tracks are a lot of fun. Listen to this one from the Roland D50. I actually had this track play at the funeral of my dog, Sennheiser. He was faithful and true to me until he bit Neil Tennant, so I had him shot. The dog.
The first synth of its type that was kind of moving towards this, big workstation idea of a synth. And it was a shame that it wasn't more multi-timbral, because it would have definitely survived the onslaught of the M1, because it sounded good. In fact, it sounded quite a lot better, I think.
The D50 was the sound of the 80s, the late 80s. Enya and Orinoco Flow, that Pizza Go-Go, I think was the name of the sound. That bum bling, bum bling. Grace Jones on Slave to the Rhythm, it's on there. Tangerine Dream were using it. Even Eric Clapton on his Journeyman album, there were some tracks on there that have got certain D50 sounds. Jean-Michel Jarre used it on his Revolutions album, and it's all over that album like a nasty rash, particularly the first track, Industrial Revolution, I think it's called, which uses a loop which is almost straight off the D50. For Michael Jackson's Bad album, which I think was '88, they used D50 sounds, but they were all reprogrammed. They were all unique sounds. It's just all over the place. There's sort of the string sounds, very warm, Rolandy sounds, if you like. For soundtracks, washes, lush sounds, the D50 was the keyboard. If you wanted pianos and authentic instruments like that, then no. I mean, it does a fairly good. It does a fairly good Moog impression. It had this. This is the in True to FX. This was the sound that you impressed your mates with if you went into the synth shop. In the middle of Let Me Be Your Fantasy by Baby D, there's a break that you can hear them use that exact sound. It was the first example of an S+S design, i.e. sampling plus synthesis. So what the machine gave you was an onboard synth, which had the usual square waves and sawtooths, etc. And you combine that with PCM samples, and there was about 100 samples in there. Combine them to create some realistic sounds. To demonstrate how it works, this is a trombone sound, so there we go, put a trombone for you. And as you can hear, there's the transient, which gives it the brass, and then there's the sustained note. So if we look at the way that's made up, by muting the various parts, you can hear the F, which is a PCM sample. You've got another breathy part of the F there, and then you've got the what actually just almost sounds like a sine wave. By taking sounds apart, you can actually learn quite a lot. You realise that instruments like a trumpet and a flute, if you chop off the initial F or the P, the actual sound of the instrument are very, very similar, but it's the transients that identify them. The D50 didn't have multi-timbral capabilities, and when the M1 turned up a couple of years later, which had a sequencer, it had 9900 memories, it had multi-timbral capabilities, 8-part, it really gave the D50 a bit of a knocking, and the M1 went on to be the biggest seller ever, I believe, and the D50 was kind of in decline after that, really.
So here's the countdown. At 20, it's the ARP Selena. At 19, the Roland SH101. At 18, the VCS3. At number 17, the Nord Lead. At 16, it's the EMU Proteus. At 15, the Roland Jupiter 8. At number 14, the Yamaha CS80. In at 13, the Mellotron. At 12, the Juno 60. At number 11, it's the Oberheim OB8. Into the top 10, at 10, the ARP 2600. At 9, it's the Virus. At 8, the Roland JV 1080. In at 7, it's the Korg MS-20. At 6, Roland D50. That's it for now. Join us next time as we continue our countdown of the 20 greatest synths of all time, ever.
There's all the major musicians. Everybody who is anybody wanted to get them to play both live and in the studio.
They're pretty reliable. We might yet build a more modern version of that.
I hated it because it didn't have any knobs on it and it was brown.
SonicState.com